From Wine Enthusiast magazine, this is the Wine Enthusiast podcast. I'm managing editor and tasting director, Lauren Buzzio. Coming up, Legacies and Lineage. We'll meet winemakers who've taken the torch from previous generations and hear how they're keeping the flame alive.
It was pretty exciting to all of a sudden see my parents' brand in other people's eyes who were professionals that, knew about wine. And I think that's when I really started to get that they had something really special.
One of the biggest advantages of working with your father or with your family is that at the end, you can really trust in each other. And that's something that is not easy to get in your lives.
There aren't many left like us, unfortunately. But if you love it and it's in your blood, which it is in mine, you do it because you love it.
Plus, the Indiana Jones of ancient ales. An expert chimes in on how far back wine's lineage really goes. It's coming up on the Wine Enthusiast podcast. Blue Apron Wine. Every wine club promises to send you tasty reds and whites, but only Blue Apron Wine partners with the world's best winemakers to get you incredible reds and whites. We're talking Vignoble Boyat Morgon, 91 points from Wine Enthusiast, and Mathiasen, nominated for a 2018 James Beard Award. Get $25 off your first shipment of 6 wines at blueapron.com/corkscrew. The world of wine is defined by tradition. From the vineyards to the barrels to your glass, so much about wine is passed on through generations. For many winemakers, the family vineyard is their literal inheritance. Today, we'll hear how second, third, and fourth generation winemakers are keeping their family legacies alive. Our first story today begins with the American dream. More than 100 years ago, Santo Cambianica left his home of Berzo San Fermo in the northern Italian province of Lombardia and set sail for America. After registering at Ellis Island, he traveled across the country to downtown Los Angeles. After a few years of saving money, building relationships, and planting his feet in the Italian-American community, Santo founded the San Antonio Winery. Santo started the company in 1917 on Lamar Street, and 100 years later, it's still there. Wine Enthusiast contributing editor Matt Kettman visited the San Antonio Winery and spoke with fourth-generation winemaker Anthony Riboli, along with his grandfather and grandmother, Stefano and Maddalena Riboli.
We are in the vintage room where there's these huge, are those redwood casks over there?
No, those are actually oak.
Those are oak casks.
From, I think, Slovenia originally. Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how it started, Anthony?
Well, thanks, Matt, for coming to visit. I know all of you listening are thinking, why is there a winery in downtown Los Angeles? So we'll start with a little history. So back in the day, Southern California, turn of the century, we're talking 1800s, it was a big agriculture area, especially Los Angeles, with many vineyards throughout. So my great-great-uncle, Santo Cambianica, came here from the Lombardy region of Italy, a little village north of Milano, and came to work for the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1912. And after about 5 years of that, as a laborer, I think saw an opportunity with this growing Italian population and their demand for wine as part of their culture, part of their consumption of meals, eating of meals, and started 1917, San Antonio Winery right here on Lamar Street, and same location we're at right now. And
what was the motivation for the name, San Antonio?
So everyone always asks why I don't have a Texas accent. So St. Anthony of Padua was his patron saint, and so good luck to have his saint in the name, and that's where it came from. So he opens up shop. It's a very simple marketing plan. People back then would have a large glass jug, so they'd drop off the empty glass jug in the morning, and on the way home they'd pick up the glass jug full of wine and go home. Right. And so he starts, and
although not the most fortuitous time to start a liquor business.
Correct.
In 1917.
Correct. So unfortunately, Prohibition occurs shortly after. And again, thank you to the Catholic Church. He was a very devout Catholic and was able to have a trade and stay in business with just local parishes. Of course, you could use wine for religious ceremonies, but the priests also were allowed to drink wine.
Right.
So he had a good relationship, and that was at least a way to survive, because Prohibition was many years. I can't remember, 13, I think, something like that, but
yeah.
a very long time.
So he's making the altar wine for all the churches around here, and then when Prohibition is repealed, what happens next?
So he, prior to Prohibition, there were 100 little wineries right here in the city of Los Angeles. So after Prohibition, fewer than 10 survived. So that was a great opportunity for growth. It just happened that my grandfather, Stefano Riboli, he had been born here in the United States, but had gone back with his family, raised in Italy, in the same village north of Milano, and his mother really wanted him out of Italy because the war was on the horizon. So he came here at 16 years old by himself in 1937.
I'm here with Stefano and Maddalena Riboli. Tell me a little bit about coming back to California.
Well, when I came back to California, I was 16 years old. For me, it was a big difference between here and LA. So I stayed with my uncle overnight, and then next door was a lady, an Italian lady. She said, "You're not gonna stay with your uncle, because he's all by himself. He's a bachelor, so you stay. I'm gonna feed you." And she was just like my mother for 4 years.
Was there a big Italian community in this part of
In this part was all, I say, 60% were Italian.
Okay.
At that time. And that's why we started, my uncle started this little winery here, because it was a lot of Italian.
A lot of customers.
A lot of customers. That's the only one that drink wine.
Yeah.
The Italian, well, we have a lot of good customers. We have a lot of Italians, French, Spaniards, Germans, and Portuguese. Those are the people that drink a glass of wine with their meal.
Okay.
The other, they were still used to either beer or the hard liquor.
And so you started, what was your first job in the winery?
Okay, the first job, the next day I got here, he said, "I'm going to teach you how to wash barrels."
How was the wine? You remember, was it good wine you were making?
It was a good dry wine. You see, it was a mixture of 3 or 4 different kinds of grape.
Yeah.
You have Carignan, Mataro, Grenache, Zinfandel. Zinfandel was one of the best.
Yeah.
See, all the grapes that were planted, they plant one line of each flavor.
Mm-hmm.
And when they pick it, they pick the 4 kinds together. There was already, the blend was already made.
Right.
That's was your Burgundy right there.
Right.
See?
Right.
And the Zinfandel, they used to keep them separate.
So how did you meet Maddalena?
Maddalena, that's a long story.
Let's hear if he's right.
I was buying the grape from this fella up in Ontario. I used to go up with this little pickup and hold, I think it was 40, 50 boxes at a time, going back and forth. Say, you have one more little load to pick up tomorrow morning, and I have a girl that I want you to meet. Oh, no, I'm too young. I'm not ready to meet any girls. Okay, so the next morning I went up there. I said, now you're coming with me, we go to her house. The house was only half a mile away. Nobody was home, so we went back to the ranch. So they said, do you see the girls over there on the tractor? That's her. From there to the street, it took them half an hour to come down. In this half an hour, I already made up my mind. If she knows how to drive a tractor, she can run a winery too.
That's great.
So that's where, so we're still here.
Yeah.
We're still.
Is that accurate, Maddalena?
That's true.
And then after I found out that she was working for the Padre Winery on the bottling line, on the champagne bottling line. So she know more than me. Probably know.
So then you became part of the winery operations as well?
Right away.
Yeah, right away.
3 days after we got married.
Yeah.
After my uncle passed away, then he turned the little, whatever the little winery was, he turned it over to me.
Right. So you're still involved. You're here every day, basically?
Well, I'd like to come here because this was my life.
Yeah.
And I like to sit with my children, my grandchildren, doing their work.
Right.
And I feel happy there. I feel better.
Yeah. Is there another generation coming up? Who's the fifth generation coming?
Well, there's Anthony.
Yeah.
That's his daughter.
There's
Your daughter.
my son.
That's what I told
has-
him, to have a boy, so at least can carry the name.
My daughter has a boy. It's, Dante. He's very good. He's 30-some years old. And we have Chris. He's 27. So they're all involved, and they do very well. And without my children and their children, I don't think we'd be in this position.
Right.
There aren't many left like us, unfortunately. The Sebastianis are gone, the Sigizios are gone, the Mondavis are gone. I mean, many families are no longer in this business, and because it's a capital-intensive business. We're dealing with Mother Nature, and there's all kinds of things that we deal with. But if you love it and it's in your blood, which it is in mine, you deal with those things, and you just do it because you love it.
We move now from California to South America. Aurelio Montes Jr. took the reins from his father, legendary Chilean winemaker Aurelio Montes Sr., in 2012. When wine enthusiast senior tasting coordinator Fiona Adams spoke with Aurelio Montes Jr., the winemaker began by telling the story of his collaboration with his renowned father.
Well, working with my father, it's at the beginning it was a kind of challenge. Your father is always your father, and you're always your son, and it's hard at the beginning because you have to build your own space inside of the company, inside of the winery, and you have to be really generous to really leave some space, for my father in my case, and my father for me. So at the beginning, sometimes you have some fights, and it's complicated, like every family. But once you get the space, once you understand each other, everything is so easy. And one of the biggest advantage of working with your father or with your family is that at the end you can really trust in each other, and that's something that is not easy to get in your life. So when you can trust 100% in someone, everything is so easy.
Do you feel like it's been more difficult or easier, sort of having a less clear boundary between work life and family life?
Winemaking and working with the family, it's not only a work, it's a lifestyle. It's I spend so many hours during the year involved with wine, traveling at the winery, during the harvest. So at the end, my family understand. Everything is all about wine. Even my vacations, normally it's in a wine area. I really love what I do. It's my passion, it's my life. So for me, even the sounds that you take work to home, it's not really like that because I enjoy what I'm doing.
Is it true that your family is the only family of winemakers in Chile that work together?
That's very true. And it's funny, it's funny because if you analyze Chile, we have been producing wine as a Chilean industry for around 500 years. In the world, in the old world, there's many wineries where you have much more than one generation as a winemaker in the family. But in Chile, we're the only one, and we feel very proud of that.
How would you describe sort of your personal philosophy for winemaking, and how do you think it compares to your father's?
The first thing that is very simple to explain is that we are two different generations. My father likes to eat meat well done, and I prefer to eat sushi. So that represents a little bit, the style of thinking of likeness of the wine, of the style of the wine. At the end, when you put all this in your taste and you want to make a wine, of course, there's a difference. But the amazing thing about working with my father is that after many fights in the past, we decided to share each experience. So he used me with my taste to really open his mind for new things, for new taste. And I use his taste, his experience to really go faster in my way of thinking. Not to make mistakes, not to make, sometimes when you're young, I'm not that young anymore, unfortunately, but when you start, it's really a big advantage, to have your father teaching you, don't go this way, I tried in the past and I made mistakes. We always talk about something, not in the middle, because we don't want to be in the middle of nowhere, but if I have more reasons to produce certain style of wine, he's going to approve that. And when my father had good reason to produce a different style than what I like it, or like it more, I agree. So at the end, you have to think of balance to understand each other.
Do you feel that the changeover has been really well accepted by, your other employees and other members of your family and just the Chilean wine community in general?
I think it's not easy to replace, if we can say like that, my father, skills, but at the end, I have been working very tough the last 10 years, in Montes, and to be with you, I feel that I got the respect of the industry. I feel that most of the people know that what is happening today in Montes, talking about the winemaking area, it's in my hands. That's the good thing about numbers, that you can see that Montes is still growing and growing quite fast, and that it's is the best or easiest way to say what I'm doing is not incorrect. What I'm doing, I feel that consumers, new generations they understand what I'm doing. They understand that even if I need to keep, to keep the tradition, because sometimes in the new world countries, like in the States, like here in Chile, tradition is not as important as European wineries. When you talk about tradition in Europe, it's something really serious. Not many months ago, last October, I visited one of the wineries that I admire more, Antinori Winery, that he has been, in the family for 600 years. So I'm saying, wow, that it's really being able to keep the tradition of the family for 600 years. And that's a big challenge and something that we don't know as a new countries. It's something that it's hard even to think about that. So for me, it's a big responsibility to keep the tradition of what my father built, but it's also my own challenge to put my own touch, in the wines.
Well, looking ahead then, would you like to see the family wine legacy continue with your own children?
Well, that's my dream. I think every father dreams when you talk about this kind of business, that one of your son or daughters continuing what you have done. So that's my dream. As my father, I don't want to push them too much. I need to show them what is all about. And since they're born, they have been following me during the harvest that I don't sleep mainly. They come here, they come to the winery, they love to come to the winery, they play in between the barrels, they play in between the tanks, they help me with the analysis, they play to be a winemaker. So for them, I want them to look this like a natural way of living. And if they like it at the end or not, it's their own decision. I can't push them, but my dream will be to have one of them, in charge of the company in the future.
We head back to California now to meet another second-generation winemaker, one who's been helping out at the family business since high school. Suzanne Groth's parents, Dennis and Judy, started the Groth Family Winery in 1982. Wine Enthusiast contributing editor Virginie Boone recently spoke with Suzanne, who eventually worked her way up to become president and CEO.
I was 12 when my parents bought the ranch. They bought 121 acres in Oakville. Nobody had ever heard of Oakville except for, of course, Robert Mondavi fans. And my parents they were 39 the year they took all their savings and bought this ranch with the intent that someday they might retire here. We were from San Jose. My parents were both born in Sunnyvale, raised in what is now Silicon Valley, of course, and they watched it change all their lives. So they knew, as young kids even, that it wasn't going to be the Libby Canning factory that their parents had worked at, or Lockheed as an electrician that my grandfather worked at. It was going to have to be something different because, of course, all the orchards were being bought up and turned into houses in Santa Clara Valley. Most of my family still lives down there, all my aunts and uncles. My father was the first in his family to go to college. He became an accountant. He didn't know what an accountant was when he was going to college, but he had a math professor take him aside and tell him he had a talent for it. And he was a young accountant for a company called Arthur Young, in my earliest memories as a small child. He would go out and meet accounts. One of the accounts was the Wente Brothers Winery, as it was called at the time. Today it's Wente Family. And he would finish doing their books, crunch their numbers for them, audit, and then at the end of the day, they would taste him on wines. And those were some of the first. He'd had wine before, but not from his parents. His friends were experimenting with wine. He was very young, in his early 20s. And then, he would take my mom on weekends to Napa Valley and to Sonoma Valley as kids. And there were really only 20 wineries, maybe. They would go to BV, Behringer. Mondavi, of course, was new and exciting because it was the first Prohibition-built winery, post-Prohibition-built winery. So they knew that, and they were impressed by the architecture and the newness. But that was really their first exposure to Napa. And it wasn't until later, I think, that they really kind of started to start the journey of loving wine together and learning more about it. I think my dad talks about his epiphany wine as a young accountant, a senior accountant, buying him dinner, and it was a BV George de Latour 1968. And that was the wine that really made him think and said, wow, I didn't know wine could taste like this. Turns out it was a historic vintage for BV too, of course. And that would have been one of the last wines made by Andrei Chelichev too. He didn't know any of this at the time. But later, he got a job for a company called Atari. But that put him in a position, since Atari did very well. Atari was bought by Warner Brothers, and that put people who were there in a financial position that he never expected to be in. So by, I think, really, the late 70s, early 80s, they're thinking, how do we invest in the future, and what is going to be something that we might be interested in doing in our retirement? And my parents argued, but they did agree that they loved wine. And so they looked at vineyards. They looked at, my brother and I remember, I was 12, Andrew was 10. My sister was already at Berkeley, my older sister. But we would spend a lot of time driving around and looking at, bat-encrusted Victorians, I mean, there were a lot of those in Napa and Sonoma, kind of abandoned wineries. Luckily, they found this property. We really thought our parents were crazy. They thought they were crazy too, by the way. They were kind of convinced that they could go broke at any minute. And those first, 15 years were hard. The first 5 years, it took 8 years to convince a bank to give them enough of a loan to build the winery. I mean, they really struggled. And there were vintages that it took them 2.5 years to sell. I mean, it wasn't until really the 1990s that things are moving through the cellar within a 12-month period. You make the wine and sell it now. At that time, we didn't. There were few wineries, but California wineries were still kind of new on the scene. So I think, until about the mid-90s, I really didn't want to be a part of the wine business. I had been working in hotels right out of college. I graduated in 92 from school with an art history degree. So useful, right? My father begged me to do accounting, but I didn't listen. So I had no marketable skill. So I worked in a hotel for the first couple of years. I lived in San Francisco, and then I got interested in the wine business. So I called my father and asked him for advice. and said, what would you do if you were trying to get into the business of wine right now? And he kind of recommended a few people to talk to, distributors, salespeople. And then he kind of paused and he said, oh, you weren't expecting me to give you a job, were you? I mean, they had 12 employees at the time. They barely had built the winery. And I kind of was like, well, no, of course I did think that might happen, but it didn't. So I ended up interviewing around and got a job working for Henry Wine Group, a distributor in Northern California, and they're still in business. But I got to sell everything from Veuve Clicquot and imports of all kinds, Italian, French. I got to sell Schaefer as well in Burgess, and I went to high school with Steve Burgess. So it was pretty exciting to all of a sudden see my parents' brand in other people's eyes who were professionals that, knew about wine. And I think that's when I really started to get that they had something really special. And by 1999, I was knocking on my dad's door again and asking for a job. And so I came aboard as a salesperson to the winery at the time.
What was the transition like for your parents to sort of begin to let go, maybe, of their, more day-to-day involvement in the winery and to sort of feel like it was ready to be in your hands? Was it something that you had to kind of kick along, or how did that go?
Well, my parents did promote me a year ago to the president position, and so I'm only the, second family member to hold it, I guess, and I would love to say they let go.
Not yet.
But, my parents are, I think they are excited that the next generation wants to be involved. And I think that they embrace the idea that any family member that wants to stay involved. We've discussed, as all family businesses do, you have that shop talk on the weekends, right, or Thanksgiving or something, and conversations come up, and we check in with each other. We're like, do we still want to do this? Do you still want to live here? Do you still want to farm? Do you still want to? Because I think our vision is that you can't really be in the wine business, at least here in Napa, unless you want to be involved yourself. We take a very personal interest, and although we're not driving the tractor and doing the pump overs all by ourselves, we're involved, and we're out on the road, we're in the cellar, we're the ones figuring out how are we going to finance the next improvements to the vineyard and to the cellar. And it's personal, very personal. And we're so wrapped up in it in this point, I think it would be really hard for me to back down, and I would really feel like I was letting the family down. But that's not the only reason I'm here. I think, everybody gets in the wine business because they love it. They love wine, they love the people, they love the landscape, we love everything about it. So I can't imagine doing anything else in a lot of ways.
Time for a break, but when we come back,
you take all these sort of hints or lines of evidence that you have, and then you try to do a recreation. This is called experimental archaeology.
A conversation with the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, wines, and extreme beverages. It's coming up on the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. Blue Apron Wine. Only the best vineyards and winemakers make the cut for a Blue Apron wine box, and every amazing wine is just $10 per bottle. Best of all, each wine comes with the backstory on who made it, where, and why. Also, you understand why the wine tastes and smells the way it does. Want to learn about wine? Blue Apron is the place to start. Get $25 off your first shipment at blueapron.com/corkscrew. Terms and conditions apply. All orders are handled by Blue Apron Wine, Napa, California. Welcome back to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. I'm Lauren Buzzio. Today, we're talking about the legacy and lineage of wine. And for our final segment, we'll go back more than a few generations. We'll rewind more than 3,000 years. Anthropology professor Patrick McGovern works at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. His title is a bit of a mouthful: Scientific Director of the Biomolecular Archaeology Project for Cuisine, Fermented Beverages, and Health. But to many people, Dr. Pat is simply known as the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, wines, and extreme beverages. Wine Enthusiast Senior Editor Layla Schlack recently spoke with Dr. Pat. She began by asking him to define extreme beverage.
An extreme beverage is something that combines lots of different ingredients together. So normally we think of wine, beer, mead made from honey as separate beverages, but most of the ancient beverages that we've analyzed and identified their ingredients tend to be very complex mixtures, often putting together a fruit, a carbohydrate resource such as a grain or a root, honey, and then also different types of herbs and spices and so on, which often have medicinal value too, and they go into solution very well in an alcoholic medium.
And how did you get into studying them?
Well, that was sort of, by a whole series of fortuitous events where we got interested in doing the chemical analyses of ancient organic compounds, which hadn't really been developed very well, say 25 years ago when we started. And so we started out with a very famous dye called royal purple of the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. And we were able to show that the compound, which is an organic compound related to indigo, called dibromo indigo for the purple, is very well preserved. We had samples going back over 3,000 years ago from a site in Lebanon. So that gave us the encouragement when someone came to us with what they thought was an ancient wine vessel to start in on the analysis. And I was working with a person, an analytical chemist, who was, his family had come over from the Pfalz area of Germany and had been a wine merchant, so he was very interested in doing the analysis as well. And I had my experiences in picking grapes on the Mosel River, for instance, and so I had kind of an interest in trying to figure out if we could really identify chemically an ancient wine. And so we started out and we were able to show that was indeed what was inside that vessel.
So is that how the research usually works? You start with a vessel and kind of analyze the trace chemicals that are left in it?
Well, usually we want to work with pottery because that absorbs liquids, and it also has a chemical structure, an ionic structure that holds these ancient molecules in place and helps to preserve them, and then we can extract them with different organic solvents such as chloroform and methanol and get out the ancient molecules. And then we go through a whole series of analyses, and we use a very sensitive technique now, which is liquid chromatography, tandem mass spectrometry, which breaks down the compound into pieces which can only come from that having a starting molecule of tartaric acid. So we get fragments, that indicate just what the original molecule was. And we put together the archaeological data that we have, and hopefully we have very good contexts that are protected, that are well dated, that haven't been disturbed in any way, either by humans coming later or other natural processes, microorganisms, and so forth. And we look at the available textual evidence, if there's any art depictions. Like in Egypt, you often get very detailed winemaking scenes, beer-making scenes. And then we look at the local people even today, because they carry on often very ancient traditions. For instance, in Egypt, there's a beverage still made in Nubia called bouza, but it's not related to our booze etymologically, but it is a very similar beer to what was made from barley and wheat millennia ago, and it's still being made, and it's still very important to the culture. So, often you have to look at, modern peoples, especially in Africa, where we all started and where our first fermented beverages were made. And there are thousands of different groups, and they each have usually their own particular fermented beverage. That they center their religion, their social relations, medicine, and so forth around. So it's you take all these sort of hints or lines of evidence that you have, and then you try to do a recreation, and we do it with this is called experimental archaeology. So we do that with Dogfish Head Brewery in Delaware, and we started out about 18 years ago with Midas Touch, which is based on a tomb in central Turkey that's believed to be either the tomb of King Midas, and there was a real King Midas, or his father, Gordius. And we've done now 9 recreations. And the idea there is just to see if we're on the right track and see what the parameters might be. See if really we're going so far astray in terms of flavor, aroma, and so forth, because we assume that humans have basically the same sensory organs, going back even millions of years, into hominid times. So, if they like something, we would probably like it too, or especially if you're upper class or royalty, then you might, have very special ingredients that you put in, and those should somehow combine. And yet, with an extreme beverage, when you mix together wine, beer, mead, different herbs and so on, you might expect that you could come up with a rather strange combination. At least when we first started out with Midas Touch, that was the feeling that we really had to test and see if this could even be made into a drinkable beverage. I mean, nowadays we have, breweries especially that are doing all kinds of crazy concoctions. But back in 2000, when we first discovered Midas Touch and started doing that recreation, we really had never heard of beer and wine being mixed together. And it turns out that all through the Middle Ages that was quite common, but then even going back into ancient times when we have these chemical analyses, that was also the case.
And then you recreate these drinks, right, once you've kind of analyzed what's in them?
Well, yes, I mean, Midas Touch, the first one we did was, really spectacular in terms of its flavor profile. It has won lots of gold tasting medals, silvers, bronzes. It's the most awarded of all the Dogfish brews. And it started out, at a time when Dogfish was just about ready to go under. Around 2000 was when there was a big shakeout of the craft brewers. And they just sort of hung on by their teeth, and they took Midas Touch and things like 90-minute IPA, and well, in the case of Midas Touch, it originally was in a 750 milliliter large format bottle with a cork, but then later, in order to survive, they made it in a 12-ounce bottle, a 4-pack, that was the same price but had twice the amount of Midas Touch that you'd buy for the same price. So it's they got them through the hard times, and it's still doing very well. I mean, it's one of their main beverages. The others that I particularly like or have an affinity towards are the oldest one that we've chemically identified, which is called Chateau Jiahu. And Jiahu is a site in China that's one of the early Neolithic sites there that goes back to about 7000 BC. So it's a beverage that is similar to Midas Touch. Midas Touch is a mixture of grape, Eurasian grape, barley, honey, and then we didn't know what the herb was. The color of the residue was yellowish. So I suggested to the owner and brewer at Dogfish Head, Sam Calagione, that he use saffron, and we know Turkey in antiquity was very famous for its saffron. It turns out that saffron is the most expensive spice in the world. So this is the most expensive beer he says he's ever made, but it turned out, really spectacularly. Now, the Chateau Jiahu is similar in that it also is a mixture of honey, and of course these will all be Chinese ingredients, honey, but rice instead of barley, and then a grape that is different from the Eurasian grape. I mean, there's more species of grape in China than anywhere else in the world. It's like 30 or maybe even 40 different species. According to our chemical analysis, Chateau Jiahu has grape, probably a wild Chinese grape, and then it also has something different than Midas Touch. It has hawthorn fruit. The hawthorn tree in China is used in Chinese traditional medicine for a lot of different things, but it has a sort of grapey flavor to it as well. So they combined all these ingredients together, and there could have been others that we just haven't identified yet chemically, different herbs.
So why did humans start creating alcohol?
Well, that's a big question, but I think it's pretty straightforward because life on this planet is really based on fermentation. So the earliest energy system on the planet is glycolysis, and each of the cells in our body, actually 50 trillion of them, are using a modified fermentation process to get energy. So my belief is that humans would have started making intentionally alcoholic beverages from fruits, honey, which has its own yeast in it, and also different carbohydrate, wild grain sources and roots of different kinds that they can chew and spit out, and that this would have happened, very early in our development. So it really is the biotechnology that was first developed on the planet, and it's been with us for a long time.
You can learn more about Dr. Pat's work with Dogfish Head Brewing by visiting our website, winemag.com/podcast. That's it for today's Wine Enthusiast podcast. We heard from Wine Enthusiast contributing editor Matt Kettman, senior tasting coordinator Fiona Adams, contributing editor Virginie Boone, and senior editor Layla Schlack. You can subscribe to the Wine Enthusiast podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review. We'd love to hear what you think. We'd also love to stay in touch. Use the hashtag WEPodcast and follow Wine Enthusiast Magazine on Facebook and Twitter. You can also send us an email. Our address is podcast@winemag.com. The Wine Enthusiast podcast is produced by Share and Shim LLC. I'm Lauren Buzzio. See you next time.